Japan owes more relative to its economy than any country that has ever defaulted. 260% of GDP. Greece never got close to this before it blew up. Argentina never got close to this. And yet, Tokyo's lights are on, the trains run on time, and nobody's panicking. So, either everything you've heard about government debt is wrong, or Japan is the one exception that explains the rule. Let's put 260% somewhere real. The US is around 120% of GDP, and people already call that a crisis. Italy, which has had actual bond market panics, sits in the 130 to 140% range. Greece peaked around 180% right before the Eurozone had to step in. Japan is at 260%. That's not a little worse than the countries that got into trouble. It's nearly double. By the textbook models economists use to predict sovereign defaults, Japan should have blown up years ago. It hasn't. Bond yields didn't spike. The currency didn't collapse overnight. There was no run on the banks. Here's the part most headlines skip. When people say Japan's debt, they picture Japan owing money to foreign creditors the way Argentina or Greece did. That's not what's happening. Roughly 95% of Japanese government debt is held domestically by Japanese banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and the Bank of Japan itself. Foreign investors hold a small fraction. That matters enormously. When Greece owed money to German and French banks, and those banks got nervous, they could pull out fast, and did. When Japan owes money mostly to its own banks and its own central bank, there's no foreign creditor to panic and trigger a run. The debt is, in a real sense, a claim Japan has on itself. And this is where it gets interesting, because the single largest holder of Japanese government debt isn't a bank or a pension fund. It's the Bank of Japan, the country's own central bank. For most of the last decade, the BOJ has owned somewhere around half of all outstanding Japanese government bonds. Think about what that actually means. The government borrows money, and the institution that prints the currency is the one buying most of the debt. That's not how debt works anywhere else in the world at this scale. This didn't happen by accident. It's the result of over a decade of a policy called yield curve control. The BOJ directly buying bonds to keep interest rates near zero, no matter what the market wanted to charge. Cheap borrowing, on purpose, funded by the central bank's own balance sheet. But, and this is the part that's changing right now, in 2026, that era is ending. As of this spring, the Bank of Japan's share of JGB holdings actually dropped below 50% for the first time in 3.5 years. The BOJ has been deliberately shrinking its bond purchases, and its total holdings have fallen by double digits from their 2024 peak. Here's the mechanism, in plain terms. When a central bank buys up huge amounts of its own government's debt, it's effectively creating money to fund the government. That's been fine for Japan as long as inflation stayed near zero and the yen stayed stable, which it did for almost 20 years. But as the BOJ pulls back, buying fewer bonds, letting yields rise toward normal levels, two things happen at once, and they pull in opposite directions. First, bond yields go up. The 10-year Japanese government bond yield, which spent years near zero or even negative, has climbed toward 2.7%. Long-dated 30-year bonds have pushed past 4%. Higher yields mean the government's interest payments on that 260% of GDP pile get more expensive, and debt service starts eating a bigger share of the budget. Second, and this is the one that hits ordinary people, the yen has been under sustained pressure. When a country runs this much debt and its central bank starts stepping back from propping up its own bonds, investors demand more to hold the currency, and it tends to weaken. A weaker yen means Japan pays more for every barrel of oil, every ton of imported wheat, every unit of imported electronics. And that shows up directly as inflation at the checkout counter. In a country that spent 2 decades trying to generate any inflation at all and is now dealing with the opposite problem. So the same debt pile that was harmless when it was quietly absorbed by the central bank becomes a genuine source of currency and inflation risk the moment that central bank has to start acting like a normal one again. So, back to the question from the top. Why hasn't 260% of GDP debt broken Japan the way 180% broke Greece? 3 reasons, working together. Almost all of it is owed domestically, so there's no foreign creditor panic to trigger a run. For 15 years, the central bank itself was the buyer of last resort, holding rates near zero regardless of the debt load. And Japanese households have historically been enormous savers, giving domestic banks and pension funds a deep, stable pool of demand for government bonds. That combination bought Japan 2 decades most countries never get. But bought time isn't the same as solved. The debt didn't shrink, it just found a very patient set of buyers. And right now, in 2026, the most patient buyer of all is stepping back for the first time in over a decade. Japan isn't proof that debt doesn't matter. It's proof that who holds your debt matters just as much as how much you owe. And as the Bank of Japan normalizes, we're about to find out in real time what happens when that unique setup starts to unwind. If you want to see how this compares to a country that didn't have Japan's advantages, Argentina, which has defaulted 9 separate times, that video's linked right here, and it's the next entry in the Country Case Studies series. I track this stuff daily at bankruptbaby.org if you want the live bond and debt data behind this video. Subscribe if you want the next case study when it drops.